welcome everyone to the Dr. DC podcast. My name is Dr. DC, and joining me is no one. I'm all alone, shambling out in the swamp where I belong. That's me, baby. Alone out in the rain, looking down at my wrist where that gold bracelet used to be. Each week, we talk about the weird and wonderful world of DC while fielding questions from listeners like you. And listen, this is a weird one. I don't think, actually, in the whole run of the show, almost 440 episodes, I don't think I've done a solo dolo main feed episode. I've had to hold it down on the Patreon a couple of times. I don't think I've ever done a main feed episode completely by myself before. But Richard is away. It's the end of prescribed reading month. The irony being that Richard picked a thing for me to read. The further irony being, it's a thing I've read before, but it's like a cool book to talk about. And it would have been nice if someone was here to talk about it. But in a way it's appropriate because we're going to talk about a real, like, lonesome, solitary, kind of gothically tragic figure. Prescribed reading month. So for this final week, you Golden Age patrons decided that we should read a book, or a story rather, featuring a largely forgotten character. And Trixie Rixie, as I like to call him, he picked an interesting little wrinkle here. He picked House of Secrets number 92. It's from 1971, specifically the story called Swamp Thing. And it's the first appearance of Swamp Thing. And you might be saying, that is not a largely forgotten character. And if you're talking about Swamp Thing, you're right. But what's interesting about this is the first appearance of Swamp Thing does not feature Alec Holland, the main kind of Avatar the Green that we know from movies, TV, comics, stuff like that. It actually features a completely different character in a completely different time period, a character called Alex Olson, who is transformed into a swamp monster. And his story takes place sort of at near the turn of the century, early 20th century. So this story is written by Len Wein. Art is by Bernie Wrightson. Like I said, this story comes out in 1971. So the general idea of the story is that it's really done in a sort of gothic horror style. So there's really no like jump scares, and there's not even really like a suspense in the way of like not knowing what's in the shadows or things like that. Because what we're doing in this is there's sort of three different people that we get sort of an interior life from. We get some like narration from kind of three perspectives, and it alternates through the story. So perspective number one is Alex Olson, a scientist who is mostly maimed, almost killed in an explosion, is buried in a swamp, and the chemicals that he was around when he exploded turn him into this shambling mass of vegetation that we now call Swamp Thing. And he's mostly just sort of sad and horrified at the monster he's become, in a real kind of like Frankenstein, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein sort of way. Like just sort of sadly like out in the woods looking at, you know, the house with the light on where his life used to be and things like that. Perspective number two is Linda Olson Ridge. So the wife of the deceased Alex Olson, who is now married to his best friend and science partner, Damian Ridge, who is the third kind of piece of this puzzle. Linda and Damian have been married for 6 months, but she misses Alex, thinks of him all the time because he died in a horrific explosion tragedy. Damian Ridge is the sort of set upon incel best friend of Alex Olsen, who couldn't stand that Linda loved him because he loved her so much. And he basically never forgave Alex for being with her, even though he knew how much Damien loved Linda. So what Damien did was actually mess with the chemicals in their lab to orchestrate the explosion that we later learned did not kill Alex. Damien dragged his body out into the swamp and left him there to die, and that's where he turned into Swamp Thing. So in this story, we have these three narrators, and what I love about this is we're really embracing the gothic horror, like the literature of it all. So this story, like all stories in House of Secrets, actually starts with a little introduction from the characters Cain and Abel. So they were like the hosts kind of these. We talked about this a couple weeks ago when we were talking about like celebrity comics. I mentioned the Elvira one, and we talked a little bit about House of Secrets and House of Mystery. So these books had like hosts in the way that like the Crypt Keeper introduces tales from the Crypt Keeper. So Cain and Abel, as in like the biblical Cain and Abel. Abel lives in the House of Secrets, and Cain lives in the House of Mystery, I believe. And so we just open with a quick thing of like Abel being scared and wanting courage, and he's like, if you have courage, turn the page, sort of thing. So then we get into the story. I just want to read the opening bit of the story because I think it really sets the tone of this gothic horror thing that we're going for here. So, I cannot remember the morning anymore, but I know the evening well. I belong to it now, and it cares for me in return, sheltering me, nurturing me, holding me close within its velvet embrace. The moon is rising now, clawing its way into the sky, a glowing amber eye that casts its disdainful gaze on the murky ooze below, the swamp that is my home. I move slowly through the moss-draped mire, treading a path that is worn smooth from my constant passing, on beyond the shadows and the dark trees' twisting tendrils to my inevitable destination, the edge of the swamp, and the mist, wet old mansion that rises like an aging apparition into a cold expanse of sky, a stately sanctuary full of bright lights and promises and memories that bring only pain. That's the first page of this story, and I think it like perfectly sets the tone again for this very Frankenstein-esque gothic horror story about Swamp Thing, this sort of shambling mass. The story is relatively simple. So it's Linda and Damien's like 6-month anniversary of being married or whatever. And Damien's like, aren't you happy? And Linda's like, no, I'm sad about fucking Alex. And Damien's like, God damn it, she's still thinking about fucking Alex or whatever. And through this, we're getting like flashbacks. We see flashbacks of how happy Alex and Linda were, of Damien being jealous, of Damien rigging the explosion, of that, like, of him leaving Alex to die, all these kind of things. Damien, because he has to invoke a different gothic story altogether, has a sort of telltale heart thing going on where he's like, she's still thinking about him. She must be onto me. She knows that I killed Alex. She fucking figured it out. She fucking knows it. So I gotta kill her. And he grabs this syringe and he's going to kill her. And what we learn is that Alex Olsen, now Swamp Thing, basically shambles here every night and looks in the window and like looks at Linda, and he's so ashamed and disdainful of what he's become. He's never gone in. He's never tried to make contact with her. He just likes to look at her and that sort of thing. I think in a more sweet way than that just came off. That sounded a little creepy, but at any rate, on this particular night, he sees Damien about to kill her, and the rage boils over between knowing that Damien killed him and then seeing that his great love is in danger. He bursts in through the window. He fucking breaks Damien's neck and kills him, squeezes the life out of him. And Linda just sees this monster and screams. And there's this really heartbreaking line that we get where where Alex says, like, I try to say something to her, but what used to be my vocal cords haven't been used in so long and no sound comes out. And he's all sad and he wanders off into the swamp and he looks down at his wrist where in life he had been given this gold bracelet by Linda. And he's like, I'll wear it always, but it's fallen off somewhere in the swamp. And he goes, it's like his last like connections to humanity are gone, and he wanders off into the swamp, and he's like, the swamp's the only thing that cares about me now, and that's it. You know, like it's a short story. I think it's only like 8 pages or something like that. But those are sort of the big plot beats of it. But what I love about this story is that it's really not about that action almost at all. It's mostly a story about romance. It's mostly a story of like interiority, a lot of memory, a lot of like speaking to feeling, and almost all narration. Very little dialogue between Linda and Damien. A lot of inner monologue and thought and reflection and memory and these sort of things. Bernie Wrightson's artwork in this is outstanding. Swamp Thing is so sad. You kind of understand the terror of both Damien and Linda when he crashes through the window, but because we've spent this other time with him, you just, all the lines, like the entire shape of him, it just looks like drooped down to the ground. Like the burden, the weight, the emotional weight he carries feels very like real and palpable. The eyes are so expressive in this. You do get the sort of trademark Swamp Thing kind of nose situation in this. But the eyes, just these sad, kind of droopy, the verging on cartoony sad eyes, but they're so kind of haunting. And especially that moment where he can't say anything to Linda. He just wants to say, like, it's me. He has no way to signal to her. She's scared. He just wanders into the swamp and he goes, I can't even come back here anymore. It's all gone for me. Really, really, really sad. But yeah, I mean, there's so much shadow in this. A lot of this kind of like chiaroscuro thing where it's like heavy, heavy shadow, single sources of light, even in certain panels, like a fireplace or a lamp or the explosion. I really like the way that this is drawn. And then when we cut to like, when we're not in memory or things like that, or inside, it's raining outside. I love like the line, like the weight of the cold and the damp outside is very, very palpable, very like real. I'd say like the weakest part of the art is actually some of the actiony stuff, Swamp Thing bursting through the window and things like that. But I love a panel of just the swampy hands grabbing Damien's throat. He describes like Damien like clawing at him, just ripping what used to be flesh off of Swamp Thing, like it's just plants and shit now. I love that. I think it's great. Like the final panels are almost entirely in the dark, but there's this one with his like hands outstretched. You can see he's like, he just wants to say like, it's me. And he can't get the words out. It's the saddest shit in the world. I stretch out my arms to her, to calm her, to comfort her. I open my mouth to tell her how much I care, but what once had been my vocal cords have been silent too long. I cannot make a sound. The tortured shadow look in her once sparkling eyes is more than I can endure. I turn my face away from her, and I start to go home. Only the swamp is kind to me now. It is only the swamp that cares. I look down at my wrist, at the barren place where once there was a golden bracelet, and I wonder where it is. If tears could come, they would. And that's the end of that story. I fucking love this story, this Swamp Thing story. It's so goddamn good. What's kind of wild about it in its way is that this story is like so self-contained. It's a great like one and done kind of thing that you would put in a book like this, House of Secrets or House of Mystery. The craziest part is that later DC is like, Swamp Thing's fucking cool. Can you make it more superhero-y? They go back to Ween and Wrightson to make a more superhero-y version of Swamp Thing. And Swamp Thing himself gets a sort of what you might call a Silver Age reboot, even though it's only like a couple of years apart. Alex Olson is this more like older idea. The Silver Age one, more superhero-y, is Alec Holland, right? A more modern one, a science thing, biorestorative formula, blah, 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 blah. And it's more about like fighting monsters and the Unmen and Anton Arcane and these kind of things. But that version of Swamp Thing also doesn't quite work. And it's not until Alan Moore comes in and we go back to the kind of gothic original idea here, but just do it with Alec Holland. And we start, the sophisticated suspense era of Swamp Thing. That's the thing that really defines this character. So what's great in this first appearance is you're like, this was the shit that resonated, right? It was not really so much what if he was a superhero. It was all of this, like the sad introspection, the body horror kind of thing. So like the mopey, what have I become? Am I even a man anymore? Blah, blah, blah. And then Moore takes that to the next level. But it's funny that it goes through these iterations where they go, that's a very cool literary thing. Make it a superhero. They make it a superhero. It doesn't quite work as well. Moore brings it back to the gothic thing, but keeps some of the stuff that Arcane, the Unmen, stuff like that. We build this new idea, but we end up kind of going back to its roots. Like this story is on to something. It resonated with people. I fucking love it so much. I think certainly of the things that we've read this month, this is the best one. And it's not even close. I really, really love this story. This is a 5 caper. It's perfect. I would change nothing about the first appearance of Swamp Thing. I think it's really, really, really cool. But yeah, fun fact, it's Alex Olson, a totally different character than Alec Holland, the later Swamp Thing. So there you go. That's the reading assignment for Prescribed Reading Month. But we got questions or since I'm just out here by my fucking self, because it's only me and only the swamp cares, we got questions about Swamp Thing. So I'm going to dive into it for me and me alone, and that's how we're doing this, baby. But before we do that, let's take a little break.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. This time of the year can be tough. It's cold and dark outside, and you feel like you're all peopled out. How do you set boundaries and give yourself the alone time you need? Most people don't have an endless social battery. Therapy can help you listen to your body and give yourself the time to recharge. In the past few years, I have made choices that have improved every part of my life, and I honestly wouldn't have been able to do any of it without therapy. Through therapy, I've gained confidence and learned to draw important boundaries. If you want to make things better or just a bit easier, or you want somebody to talk to, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, so it's easier to fit into any schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. And you can even switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/DrDC today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/DRDC.
And we're back. All right. Diving into the questions here, talking about Swamp Thing. First place we're going is Threads. Threads. And a question from JVideo13 who asks, favorite underrated run on Swamp Thing? It's tricky because Swamp Thing does an underrated run, I think, is the hardest part to pin down for Swamp Thing, because I do think that it's gotten, no pun intended, this series and this character really get its flowers a lot. People really know and appreciate Swamp Thing. It's sort of held up in the sort of comic canon in the way that Sandman, like other kind of big things are. It's totally earned that place. And so trying to think of a version of it that's maybe underrated is maybe slightly harder. Appropriately rated is like the Moore Bissett kind of run, the saga of the Swamp Thing sort of thing. It's amazing. If I had to go with something, I'd go with the sort of the late New 52 Swamp Thing. Early New 52 Swamp Thing is Scott Snyder and Yannick Paquette, which is quite good and sort of reestablishes the status quo for Alec Holland and things like that, which is interesting and good, and like lots of good Arcane stuff and the Rot, and setting up the relationship of the kingdoms, the green, the red, the black. That stuff's good. But I would actually say the late New 52, I think it's Charles Sewell was the writer there, and forgive me, I don't remember the artists offhand. Got into some interesting stuff because we really expanded that idea of the kingdoms through the New 52. And by the time you get to the end of that run, there's this awesome arc called the Machine Queen, where like artificial intelligence becomes the new kingdom. So there's the green, which is like the collective consciousness of all plant life. There's the red, which is the collective consciousness of all animal life. The black, or the Rot, is the collective consciousness of like decay and death. And through that, we got the gray, or the Mycos, which was like fungal life. We got the divided, which was like bacteria and things like that. And we end up with the rhythm, which is the machine kingdom, which is sort of, the combined consciousness, the collective consciousness of artificial intelligence. And I really liked it, like there was a machine avatar. Swamp Thing was up against this thing that's like very like, even more than going up against something from the red or these other things that are more like natural or organic. The rhythm was such a different kind of, it's like a cold, calculated thing. It's unnatural. It's artificial. And putting that up against Swamp Thing was really interesting. And I thought it was a cool continuation and exploration of those ideas of like these kingdoms, and that they don't just all spring into existence at the same time. There are young ones and old ones. And we sort of established this idea that it's like every time a new kingdom comes in, it thinks it should take over, and it goes hog wild, and all the other kingdoms have to stop it. And then eventually they all learn how to live in balance with each other until a new one comes along and gets too big for its britches. And I liked that idea of even the sort of cycles of like understanding and like self-awareness and like knowing the place of the natural world and how that evolves over time and things like that. I thought it was a really cool run. I liked it. I don't know that everyone felt that way, but that might be the closest I can think of to like a quote underrated run on Swamp Thing that I really love. So I would check that one out if I were you. Right, so we're going to leave Threads and head on over to Instagram. Now we're going to Instagram, take some questions and answer them. And first question comes from Mike the Beast Benson, who asks, have you guys watched the Swamp Thing live action show? If so, what were your thoughts? It's my personal favorite live action DC show, and I'm still crushed it got canceled. Yeah, I mean, both Richard and I have seen this show. Both of us really, really liked it. I mean, I think there's an old double dose somewhere on the Patreon where we talked about it. Those are sort of the halcyon days of DC Universe where we were like, oh my God, it's happening. I mean, The ultimate issue with the show is that it costs so much fucking money. But what makes the show great is like it shows. Like the effects are great. The suit is amazing. Like Derek Mears as Swamp Thing is such incredible casting. I think the thing that like maybe when you look at it as a single season entity, the thing that becomes a distraction a little bit is like that we've got Madame Xanadu in there, that we like set up the Phantom Stranger, that there's a whole like origin story for Blue Devil, because they were clearly angling towards making a Justice League Dark kind of thing. But this show just cost so much goddamn money. But what the show does so well is really capture that tone, that literary tone of Swamp Thing, the sort of gothic horror-y tone of Swamp Thing. I think the casting on the show is amazing. I loved who they've got as Abby Arcane. I liked Ian Ziering as what's his name? The guy that becomes Blue Devil. I liked him. I liked, it's David Morse, I think, plays, like the bad guy, like the guy that runs the company. The casting of fucking, Jason Woodrue, Floronic Man, another actor whose name is escaping me, but he played like Blob in X-Men Origins Wolverine, and a very like known quantity actor, but he's incredible in that. And like right near the end of that series, he becomes the Floronic Man, and you see that, and like that looks amazing. They fucking pulled off the anatomy lesson, like the biggest Swamp Thing story, the most iconic Swamp Thing story. That episode is incredible. It's great. Real high concept stuff. They really threaded the line with, there's some procedural elements, there's the horror side, you know, like seeing people like sort of explode into plants to try to solve this kind of crime and things like that. But also just having this sort of occult kind of angle. There's some really creepy, episodes and things that worked really well. Yeah, that show fucking rules. I mean, it is very sad that they didn't get to keep it going, but it's also like 100% expected. Like, I don't know how much they spent on that show, but like you could tell it was like too much for 13 episodes, like to the point where 13 episodes was them like actually cutting the production order. It's not like they finished filming everything they were going to film. They actually stopped production on the show. There was going to be more than that. And they were like, this is costing way too much. Absolutely not. So, you know, it's actually it's sort of wild that they managed to give it any sort of kind of finish whatsoever. But yeah, I fucking love that show. I think it's really, really well done. And hopefully, you know, well, I mean, I shouldn't say hopefully. It's obviously a good proof of concept of how cool a Swamp Thing can be. You know, the Wes Craven Swamp Thing movies are like, they are what they are, you know. The Swamp Thing cartoon from the 90s is like, I don't really know if we should go by that. But, you know, I know we don't have news about a lot of things of the new James Gunn DCU, but Swamp Thing was part of that. Last I had heard, I think that was like James Mangold was maybe in talks to direct that or whatever. So making Swamp Thing a sort of like big piece of it, maybe to anchor the more magic-y kind of side of, or the Justice League Dark kind of side of things, is great. And, you know, Swamp Thing should be a real anchor character that way. I think there's a lot to play with there, and certainly tonally, it's interesting to have something so different from usual superhero stuff. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and I think the show probably, I would suspect, helped that way, because they're like, listen, that costs too much, but like, look how fucking good Swamp Thing could be. And you're just like, yeah, well, we can figure that out. We can make a movie cost a lot of money and make money back on it, maybe in a way that a show on a brand new proprietary streaming service that didn't last that long, like, couldn't have done. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the Swamp Thing live action show. Yeah, if you're on the Patreon, go search back through the double doses. I'm positive we talked about Swamp Thing years ago when it actually came out. All right, next question comes from Mara in Iowa, who asks, sorry, took a drink. Mara in Iowa asks, I have found Swamp Thing to be a bit of an odd character. Do you like the older iterations or the newer ones more? In the more contemporary versions, he seems more like an earth elemental, like the ones from Hellboy 2. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, the timeline of this started talking about, right? So the first appearance of Swamp Thing, he's just like, he's a dude that something bad happens to in a very like Frankenstein-y way, and he's sad and he lives in the swamp. Alec Holland, the sort of kind of quote Silver Age, not truly, but that sort of spirit reboot of the character, still had horror elements. Like his main adversary, Anton Arcane, was like a necromancer and like a guy that was like sewing bodies together, making these unmen, basically zombies, sort of like zombies where it's like it would just be like a foot and a skull, and it would like hop through the like the swamp and shit like that. And that he was a little bit more action oriented, but still pretty definitively in the realm of like horror. And then the more like Bissett era, we bring back that sort of literary, maybe philosophical side. And that's the era where it's not just that Alec Holland was transformed into a swamp monster. The Moore era gives us this story, The Anatomy Lesson, maybe the most famous Swamp Thing story, where it's revealed that Alec Holland is dead and that the swamp, the plant life that became Swamp Thing, absorbed Alex's consciousness. So it's plants that believe themselves to be Alec Holland. And so that's its own like crazy twist. It's like there's an extra layer of the Frankenstein's monster thing there where it's like, it's not just that I'm not a man anymore. It's that I've never been a man. I have stolen memories, a stolen life. I'm just plants that came to life. What am I? Who am I? Like, how do I reconcile that? A real kind of interesting character piece and a lot of like very kind of painful sort of self-reflection comes from that. Really great era for it. But that era also, we expand the lore of Swamp Thing quite a bit. We introduce John Constantine in the pages of Swamp Thing in this era. Constantine helps Swamp Thing discover the Parliament of Trees, which is this concept where basically the Swamp Thing we know is what we call the avatar of the green. But the idea of the green is also introduced in this era. So Swamp Thing is not just a guy that turns into plants. He's not even just plants that came alive and think they're a man. He's actually a chosen champion to represent the collective consciousness of all plant life on Earth. And that collective consciousness is governed by the Parliament of Trees, which are essentially like, well, we learn later, the former avatars of the green become one with the green and serve as part of the Parliament. The closest analogy in like other pop culture, I think, to this is the Force. And the idea that like most things, when they die and are subsumed by the Force, they lose their individual consciousnesses. But certain chosen kind of few, in a way, can retain a little bit of themselves, at least for a bit, after they pass and join the Force. The Parliament of Trees is essentially like a council of Force ghosts. There's like, we were once Jedi, and we're here to choose you, train you, pick you, whatever. But they are largely inactive in the physical realm. The green is like the Speed Force, a very kind of bizarre sort of liminal space that is not technically a real place, but has junctions in the real world, like the swamp in Louisiana where Alec Holland makes his home. Or it's a power, it's a realm, it's sort of almost, I would say, adjacent to something a little extra dimensional. because I think it can be represented as a physical plane, even though you would maybe join it mentally or spiritually. But it also does act physically. Like the Swamp Thing can teleport through the green. Basically, anywhere there's a plant, Swamp Thing can show up. But the green is essentially all these concepts are like, you're not just a person that became plants or whatever. We are empowering you with all of the power and the consciousness of the green, of all plant life, to be our protector, to defend the cause of like ecology and plant life and things like that, which is such a cool concept. And, you know, like I said, like future runs of Swamp Thing expand that out across the other kingdoms, right? So that the Avatar, the Red, is Animal Man's daughter is the chosen Avatar, the Red, but he's sort of given sort of temporary, sort of like regent kind of powers over it. Anton Arcane gets retconned as the Avatar of the Rot, of the Black, which is a cool way to tie in his old kind of necromancy powers in that, but then also give him a sort of heightened power boost to go up against Swamp Thing and stuff like that. I love that shit. I mean, as we know, I'm a lore boy, a lore whore, if you will, if you listen to Ghost Facers. So all that stuff about the kingdoms and avatars and parliaments and passing on this power and having these like these sort of spiritual causes and things like that. I fucking love all of that shit. It weaves such an interesting like magical tapestry into DC. I love the idea of like the natural world having protectors. That's tied to stuff I like in other things, like having a Tom Bombadil in Lord of the Rings, right? I wouldn't want him in the movie. It doesn't make sense in a movie, but like, fuck, do I love that he exists in the books. We don't even answer really what he is, but all that stuff speaks to the same kind of ideas of like the natural world having its own life and consciousness and protector and stake in the outcome of the world and things like that. I fucking love all of that shit. So for me, the more we dive into the elemental side of it, the more I like that character. I'm as much as I love that Swamp Thing story that we read, the House of Secrets 92 one, I like that as an artifact and as an individual story. Do I want like 1 million years worth of Alex Olsen stuff? Not really, although we will talk about it. Alex Olsen does come back, but the reason that I think I'm into it is because we're tying it into this like history of avatars of the green, that there are multiple Swamp Things through history sort of idea. That's what's like, I don't need like the continued adventures of Sad Guy and Swamp. I need like the continued adventures of Sad, like Swamp calling. You know what I mean? Like there's something about the combined thing of the interior story of these characters that are turned into this monster and the bigger thing about being this chosen protector and sort of serving like this very spiritual higher calling. So I love the elemental stuff. Long way to say that, I think. Right, we're leaving Instagram. We're heading on over to Reddit, where everyone's nice and no one's ever mean. And we got a question from Bangarang8, who asks, has Alex Olsen made any other major appearances in the DC universe? The answer is yes. So, like I just alluded to, in the way that I fucking love when anyone does it, if it's Mark Waid or Jeff Johns or Alan Moore or whatever, or Morrison or Gaiman or whatever, taking a thing and giving it some new life or weaving it into something else, or like James Robinson's Starman. Moore takes Alex Olsen and makes him canon. Like when they launched Swamp Thing #1 and it has Alec Holland in it, they're just like, well, we redid it. It's a revamp. And Moore goes, no. There's an opportunity here. And we go back and we insert Alex Olsen as a time-appropriate predecessor of Alec Holland. So the idea, again, is that the green always has a chosen avatar. And so what we do eventually when does Moore take over? Like issue 20 or something of Swamp Thing? Somewhere in the 30s, I think. So not too long into it, we learn a little bit more about Alex Olsen, who again became a Swamp Thing. I think we learned like he ends up like moving to the Louisiana swamp, which is then, you know, sort of like the locus of power for the Parliament of Trees. We learned that somewhere in there. And then there's like a anniversary sort of special issue. I think it's like issue 92, right? Because House of Secrets 92 is the first appearance. So I think in Swamp Thing 92, we maybe see Alex Olsen again. He's become a member of the Parliament of Trees. He's a Force Ghost, like I said. And sort of gives some guidance and stuff to Alec Holland. But it's that idea of making him part of that history in the way that I love in that Starman book, where they're like, we're not just forgetting about the weird Prince Gavin one or the weird Michael Thomas one or the weird Will Payton one or whatever, or the weird one-off Detective Comics one. All of these Starmen are going to get their moment. They're going to be part of the story. They're going to be integral. They're all going to be connected in a way that we didn't know before. And I think Robinson probably takes cues for that from people like Gaiman tying a bunch of Sandman stuff together, from people like Moore tying a bunch of or people like Morrison tying a bunch of Animal Man kind of animal stuff together, you know, Bwana Beast and the Shining Man and all this kind of stuff. I think they take cues all from Moore doing it with Alex Olsen and inserting him into the lineage of Swamp Thing. Now, Alex isn't the only one. We invent other Swamp Things. There's one from like the war who might be German or something like that. There's quite a few, but I do love that idea of bringing Alex Olsen back, giving him a proper place in the history of Swamp Thing. It's just a nice nod. He doesn't show up as like a continued character. They don't go on like buddy cop adventures, nothing like that. But it's a nice way to like tip the hat, acknowledge the story that kicked off the legacy of this character, and make them a bit more meaningful. That it's not just like we kind of half had an idea and then we changed it later. It's like, no. That idea exists. It's its own thing. It's sort of crystalline, and we get to preserve it and count it as canon for whatever that means, and just love it for what it is. And I think that's a lot of fun. All right. We're leaving Reddit. We're heading on over to the doc. The doc scored. Hang on. I could do this. I never meant to dox, so scored to you. And when I dox, I scored it dox or two. Yeah, that's good enough. Heat of the moment. I've definitely done heat of the moment before, right? First question from the doc scored comes from Fingerstripes 13, good old Fingers Grayson, who asks, on the Swamp Thing as a mantle, who's the new Swamp Thing who helped the Titans during Beast World? How does he differ from the Alec Holland Swamp Thing / plant consciousness version of the character? So, great question. So, that Swamp Thing, his name is Levi Kamei. He's like very, very new. First appearances in 2021. He's created by Ram V and Mike Perkins. So the idea of this character is he is the new and current Avatar of the Green. Alec Holland is now part of the Parliament of Trees. Now, we all know Alec Holland's going to do his own thing. You know, like stuff changes, right? But Levi Kamei is the current and new Swamp Thing. He is from India. He is sort of tricked into kind of like selling out some part of sacred forest and swamp from the region of India where he's from to this big company. he gets chosen by the Green basically to defend it. I can't remember the name of the swamp, the Kazaringa or something like that. I mean, I'd say the primary difference between Levi Kamei and Alec Holland is that Levi Kamei is definitively a person that also turns into Swamp Thing. He is both. Well, sorry. What I should say is I do think at some point he gives up being human, but he does have that kind of arc, that sort of trajectory. He's a human that becomes Swamp Thing as opposed to just plants that think they're a man. The thing with the Alec Holland thing is that it's an accident. We learned like they wanted a different avatar, but they wanted Alec, but he dies in this explosion and is coated in this, but the biorestorative formula sort of sets things in motion. But he actually dies before he could just be made Swamp Thing. And so the Parliament of Trees is like, but we need a champion. And so they create a Swamp Thing and attach Alex's consciousness to it in a sort of like fucked up, like sort of patch job. But ordinarily, if there was no explosion, Alec Holland would be this kind of Swamp Thing, like Levi. He would be like a person that gets these powers. But instead, he was this other weird, awful kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like Alex Olsen, again, he didn't die in the swamp. He was left for dead and then turned into a monster. So Alec Holland is actually like a weird one. That's a weird situation where he becomes this plant kind of golem with no soul of its own for a bit and off and on. And there's all these retcons and stuff. So the primary difference is that Levi Kamei is just chosen and human. At a certain point in that series, if I'm not mistaken, he does sort of let go of his humanity a bit and be fully kind of become more of a Swamp Thing. But that is the Swamp Thing that shows up during Beast World, the one that shows up to help the Titans. That's Levi Kamei. Interestingly, I talked about that Charles Sewell run of Swamp Thing where I really like the Machine Kingdom, where it's the collective consciousness of artificial intelligence. The run of, I think it's called The Swamp Thing, which is Levi Kamei's series. I think it went to 16 issues or something like that. That series introduces yet another artificial kingdom called that includes the Parliament of Gears. And basically, it is the collective consciousness of industry, which I mean, that's a fucking lore concept I love to death. And it is distinct from artificial intelligence. It's about like literal like consumption, production, metal, gears, things like that. Like, it's almost, I mean, everything is Tolkien-esque to me because that's what everything comes back to, but it's, where the Machine Kingdom is more about the digital space. The Parliament of Gears and the Industry Kingdom is more about, it's about the manufactured space. And that I find very interesting. That series brings in fucking Jack Hawksmoor, who's the character that can, from, like Wildstorm, who can like speak to cities, because they make the Parliament of Gears come to life in Detroit, like in Motor City, you know, like there's some cool shit in that book, and lore wise, that's like right where I fucking live. And I love that idea of Parliament of Gears, maybe even more than I like the idea of the Machine Kingdom. I think it's such a cool, high concept, really neat antithesis to the Green. You know, I love Anton Arcane. I like coming back to someone like a force of life fighting a force of death. But there's something about this, like things that grow versus things that destroy. And that's really what like the Parliament of Gears is. Again, consumption, growth, expansion is like in a way that's different from like the life side of the Green or whatever. That shit's awesome to me. So if you haven't read The Swamp Thing, again, I think it's like 16 issues, Rom V, Mike Perkins, I believe. And that's yeah, that's a series I would pick up. Really, really, really cool shit. It also brings in Floronic Man, Poison Ivy. Very cool, cool stuff. So yeah, I would check that one out. But that's Levi Kamei, the current Swamp Thing. Next question comes from Cosmic DM Classic, who asks, if they made a new Swamp Thing movie, how would you cast Ray Wise of Swamp Thing, Twin Peaks, and RoboCop fame? So, Ray Wise is one of those actors that, like, if you saw him, you'd be like, oh, that guy, he's in everything. Yeah, he's Leland Palmer in Twin Peaks. Plays Leon Nash in RoboCop. I mean, fuck, I just pulled up, like, his IMDb. I mean, he works so goddamn much. Like, I've been scrolling for a bit. I'm still in, like, 2019. Like, if we went back to, like, his bigger stuff, you're going, like, way back. Yeah, all sorts of cool shit. How would I cast Ray Wise in Swamp Thing? Very tricky. I suppose it's probably too obvious to say I'd cast him as what's his name? Parsons, or basically the guy that David Morse played in the TV show. Like the guy that runs the company. Ray Wise would be, I think he'd be, I mean, he's a lot older now, so he's probably aged out of the Floronic Man or something like that. I don't really see him for like Arcane or anything kind of that way. He might be like an interesting, like, random Parliament of Trees mentor. Like, put him in that sort of like older, mentor kind of position. That might be sort of interesting, is to give him that. It's a good question though. I don't know that Ray Wise is like the person I'd think of first, but I mean he's got the chops and he's been in so much goddamn stuff. He'd be cool. He'd be good no matter what. Yeah, maybe like part of the Parliament or something like that is where I'd put him. Part of the Parliament or absolute corrupt, polluting businessman sort of situation. I think those are the two options for Ray Wise. If I, we say if they make a Swamp Thing movie, apparently they are. So until I'm told they're not, I'm going to keep going with that. Next question comes from JK, who asks, do you think there are more tales to tell with Alex Olson, or more period piece gothic horror romances at DC? I think we're about done with Alex Olson. Not in the way that he can never show up again, but like, we tied him in. The work to integrate him has been done. I don't know that we need... I don't think it adds anything to the mythos to say, like, and here's his cool untold Alex Olson Swamp Thing adventure from, like, 1920 or some shit like that. Like, I don't need to see him, like, punch, like, a coal miner or something like that in the 20s. Like, that's sort of unnecessary. Like, that House of Secret Stories is more or less one and done. We could have just left it there. What's nice about integrating him into the series later is giving, like I said, tipping the hat, including it in the myth so that it's not just like sort of washed away like, well, that was the first appearance, but they didn't do anything with that. He's part of the myth of Swamp Thing. And that's nice, but I don't think we really need more. I certainly don't need like more Alex Olson. If we're just talking generally, is there room for more period piece gothic horror stuff at DC? Absolutely. All the fucking time. They did a fucking Dead Man gothic horror thing not that long ago. Yes. Gothic horror, there's always a place for it. That shit works so well. There are so many characters in DC that it works for, because DC's magic side is fucking awesome. So you between Phantom Stranger, Zatanna, and Swamp Thing, or Deadman, or Nightmare Nurse, or, just like pick characters, throw them in. There's so much fertile ground for like gothic. And that's me even just like being a little too on the nose with it and picking kind of horror magic adjacent characters. You don't even really have to do that to do a proper gothic horror. You could do it with Batman and Catwoman. You could do it with, like, pick someone, I think there's always room for that. It's a tone I love. It's a genre I love. I think when it's done well, it's some of my most favorite stories are kind of gothic romance sort of things. Even more than like sci-fi, fantasy, things like that, where I obviously love lots of stuff, but something really, really grabs me about a gothic romance. And yeah, I'd give my like left arm for some more of that kind of good shit. That's right where I live. You don't have to sell me. Next question comes from Yokrowo, who says, not so much a question, but a request. Would you be so kind and put that creative, beautiful, ball-delicious, valiant, valorous, and sharp-witted mind to the test and create a bizarro version of Swamp Thing? Hashtag Summer of Kindness, baby. Yeah. All right. Bizarro Swamp Thing. Well, if we went with the like anatomy lesson thing, then I guess we're talking about a man who thinks he's plants. His Bizarro Swamp Thing is a guy with no plant powers who believes himself to be plants. So you could go one step further and say he's actually like the avatar of the red, but he's convinced that he's made of plants. So he has like, I almost said meat powers, when he like animal powers. He's connected to the morphogenetic field, the web of animal life. Meat powers is such a horrible way to put that. But yeah, he's convinced that he's like a bunch of geraniums or like a fucking tree or something like that. And then he discovers, to his horror, he has like real organs, or I mean, in the anatomy lesson, it's that the plants formed like organs inside him. Not that they worked like lungs in that, but that his consciousness sort of formed himself that way because that's what he thinks he should be. So in that case, it'd be a man made of meat and stuff, but when you opened him up, it would just be like, it would look like the inside of a plant. It'd just be like a stalk, or like there'd just be like rings of meat inside him, like the trunk of a tree or something. Like he's not you know what I mean? He's not built like a person where the organs where they should be. He's built like a plant, but made of not plant material. He would also be so happy. He loves it. He's not sad in any way at all. I think he's great. Yeah, what's another sort of bizarro component of that we could throw in? I guess, no, I think those are the big ones. I really like leaning on this idea that like someone jammed a bunch of meat into the shape of a tree, but it's a person and he thinks he's plants. That's your Bizarro Swamp Thing. There you go, Yokro. Next question comes from Drago the Black Rose, who asks, why are the Parliament of Trees such dicks? Like, why aren't they cool like the Ents? I mean, listen, the Ents are fucking cool, but to be fair, they are aloof, forgetful, sort of stewards of the forest, right? You know, they almost to the point of negligence, right? The Ents are like, wars don't affect us. And then they go like, oh, fuck, wars do affect us. Like, fuck, like they're pretty disconnected, which interestingly is also the problem with the Parliament of Trees. The Parliament of Trees, because they are joined to the green, they're sort of almost no longer really part of the physical realm. Their consciousness starts to fade, or rather their individual consciousness does. And as they join with the green, I think they lose touch in that sort of Dr. Manhattan or whatever kind of way. They lose touch with their old humanity, the thing that used to keep them grounded. This is part of the reason they choose an avatar, is that they understand that the person has to be grounded in the real world, because the green has been around for so long that they know, like they know at somewhere deep down that the world can't just be the green. There's got to be balance with the red, with the black, blah, blah, blah. And choosing the avatar, making them like a thing of the red, choosing them to represent the green, is a way of maintaining that balance and acknowledging that the green has a place in the world, but not the only place. However, that being said, they've set up that system and that's great, but that does not mean that the green like always remembers that. Sometimes they go, this fucking avatar won't make like the world all plants or like kill all the meat or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes the green and the Parliament of Trees loses its way. That shit happens all the goddamn time. But it's because I think they have a singular interest, which is in the survival of plants. And secondly, they are losing touch with the real world and their humanity. So it starts to become a thing of like, like anything else where you're not considering context, or you lack the ability to empathize or things like that. When the Atlanteans, see their ocean getting polluted, they're like, fuck the surface, kill them all. They're not thinking in terms of like, well, the surface are also people, and like not all of them are bad, blah, 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 blah. We're not doing that kind of conversation. The green and the Parliament of Trees, I think, are the same way, where they're cutting down the forest, like turn them all into fucking flowers or whatever. They get pissed at the avatar sometimes when he is maintaining more balance. Sometimes they're like, maybe we should choose a new avatar because you won't do what we want. Sometimes it's about control. It's like the Guardians of Oa. It's like so many of these groups that are sort of disconnected from the power they bestow a little bit. That it's just a lack of perspective, right? It's a lack of being boots on ground. It's that sort of thing. It's very similar, actually, to the Guardians of the Universe in that way. Also, historic dicks. But yeah, I mean, that's, I think, my general take on the Parliament of Trees. I think that largely makes sense. Okay, final question comes from the Lord Your Butt, who asks, it seems that Swampy can be anywhere that the green is present. Is the only way to kill him to eliminate the green entirely? Yes. I mean, the most definitive proof for that is, I mean, there's lots of proof for it, but to me, the most definitive proof for that is death metal. In death metal, the Darkest Night, who is the Batman who laughs with the power of Dr. Manhattan, reshapes the fucking universe, and like the worlds are destroyed, the multiverse is crumbling. There's only like 7 Earths left in the multiverse or something like that. Like, everything has fallen apart, and Swamp Thing is still fucking there. Now, he looks like a goddamn tumbleweed. He's like kind of burning embers, and his power is very weak. But it's like, while there's a fucking seed on Earth, Swamp Thing has some power. Now, he doesn't have a lot. As you cut back the green, as you destroy plants and things like that, you directly destroy and impact Swamp Thing's abilities and stuff like that. But yes, essentially, until there is no plant left, Swamp Thing exists. Now, at a certain point, he's too weak to do anything or really feature. Swamp Thing can manipulate and connect to like the gut flora that we have like in our bodies, but you'd have to get rid of every feasible kind of plant material to truly and completely destroy the green or destroy Swamp Thing. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't like effectively destroy him. You know what I mean? At a certain point, there's not enough plants left for him to maintain consciousness or to draw any power or to like, maybe he's alive, but he can't do anything. Like there's more than just death on the table, but I think strictly speaking, the phrasing of this question, you can't destroy Swamp Thing entirely without eliminating the green. Now, I should say that's not quite the same as killing an individual Swamp Thing. I'm talking about destroying the idea of Swamp Thing. Theoretically, you could kill Swamp Thing. A lot of them are still supposed to be like people who get the power of the Avatar of the Green. Like the old Swamp Thing, like before the anatomy lesson thing, he could get stabbed, he'd bleed and shit. Cause there's like, he was basically like a guy inside plants, You can kill an Avatar of the Green. The rot, when he goes up against Anton Arcane or whatever. Like, death is on the table for an individual Swamp Thing. But in terms of how do you destroy the green, the source of power, how do you stop it from making a new one? That you sort of have to wipe out all plants. So that's that kind of thing. But you can kill an individual Avatar. It takes a ton of power, and it's not easy to do. But you can slow them down. You can freeze them. If you know the anatomy lesson, you can capture them. You can knock them out. Like, they're not impervious, There are ways to do it, but they are massively powerful. It's not technically that easy. But yeah, you can kill an individual Avatar. More easily than you could destroy the green. Yeah, there you go. Well, shit. There you go. An entire solo dolo episode of the Dr. DC podcast about fucking Swamp Thing, which I love to goddamn death. That is the last main feed episode of the Dr. DC podcast. It's the last one. We're done. That's I said the quiet part loud. No, it's the end of Prescribed Reading Month. Which is a ton of fun. Over on Patreon, there's one more episode left for Prescribed Reading Month. I was just going to try to pull up what we are reading because I don't remember. But tune in on Friday and you will see us discussing... Oh, Fun Home by Alison Bechtel. That's what we're talking about for the final Patreon episode of Prescribed Reading Month. And theme for next week, not announced yet, but you'll see it when the call for questions goes out. But if you want to get in touch with us or send those questions in, you can reach out to us on wherever we are on social media, Dr. DC Podcast in basically everywhere. You can send us an email to drdcpodcast@gmail.com. There's our nice subreddit, r/Dr_DC. And if you want to support us even further, got our Patreon. I just talked about the double dose where we're reading more stuff during Prescribed Reading Month, but you go to patreon.com/DrDC. There's a $1, $5, $7 level. All of them give you access to the Discord, our amazing Discord fan community. At the higher levels, you get the double dose, our weekly bonus episode. And at the highest tier, the $7 tier, the Golden Age tier, you get to vote on episode themes each month. There's also bonus series. There's Toretto Talks, a Fast and Furious rewatch. There's Bonding Time, a James Bond rewatch, or the current Cerebros, the X-Men rewatch series that I'm doing with Matt Poulter. That's all there, and the Patreon helps to support us, so go check that out. And of course, if you like what we do and you want even more and you want it for free, you greedy motherfuckers, then you can go and check out Ghostfacers, a Supernatural rewatch. We're going through every single episode of the CW Supernatural. It's me and Richard, baby, although this week it was just me. But we're partway into season 9 of 15. We go through real world monster lore. We talk about behind the scenes stuff about the show. It's a really fun time. If you like how we talk about like the lore of stuff here, that's a big part of what we're doing over on that show over there. So at any rate, thank you for joining. That has been Prescribed Reading Month. Fucking love it. What a good note to end on. Yeah, we'll see you next week. Adios.
Ciao, ciao.
Heroes. They always fight for what is right. Live with danger and adventure. They are men of might.
This was a Brain Freeze podcast.